After making an overview video covering some of the larger pillars at the foundation of Star Citizen's 3.7 release in November of last year, I knew it would be one of many videos that I would be making for the game on its road to release. And really, that video only covered the tip of the iceberg for many of the aspects of the game's technology. Through happenstance and through the help of some key individuals, I was invited over to Cloud Imperium Games' studio in Wilmslow in the UK to interview developers working on a number of the project's technical aspects and capture some incredible in-game footage of features found in the now current Star Citizen 3.8 release, and also some features that will be coming in the future. I captured so much footage and covered so many topics that I cannot realistically fit them all into one coherent video. So in this first outing of this mini-series on Digital Foundry, I will be covering something that I could not cover in my initial video. That is the incredible scale that Star Citizen's technology enables, and how the universe is being built, from the massive structures in space to the planets and their myriads of biomes, and how it all comes together to create this incredible visual experience that we can see on screen. So let's suit up, jet on in, and find out. One massive planet, Microtech as it's known in-game, a corporation-owned world filled with forests, snow, and even topped off with a frozen ocean. On the ground, it is incredibly detailed, and manages to hold up when we get out to view it from orbit. How is this level of detail and scale at all possible in the first place? And how is it made? To get such a huge planet in the game working at all, it first required a different type of engine design than what is typically used in many other games. Asking multiple developers on the game, one of the greatest challenges of getting Star Citizen working in the first place as a massively multiplayer game was due to its scale. In a normal multiplayer game, or single player game even, you have dedicated levels or dedicated open worlds of limited size. As I mentioned in my last Star Citizen video, Star Citizen of course requires a larger scale of magnitude. To enable this, the developers converted the engine to use 64-bit coordinates to enable solar-sized game spaces. But that is not the only thing that is different from the usual. In many games, the player's speed and view is predictable, or able to be designed and planned around, so you have dedicated loading between larger zones, or smaller streaming of smaller world objects as you slowly cruise through it. Star Citizen is a bit different, as you are able to move great distances at great speeds and change your view rapidly, which presents a problem. You can have extremely detailed objects added into the player view really quickly, which made traditional loading and a level style no-go for Star Citizen. Imagine jumping into a planet or entering a space station and suddenly having it load. A loading screen pops up, or even worse, a massive stutter that traditional systems might have, but that would not line up with the game's ambitious designs for being seamless. One way around the dilemma would be to keep the entire game's assets in memory the entire time. The problem is of course that the immense size of the individual game assets with all their detail would require impossible amounts of memory for consumer PCs. Since not everyone has hundreds of gigabytes of RAM, the idea of object containers and object container streaming was born. Simply, an object container is any world object large enough to have a number of nested objects within its bounds, or an object with an extensive amount of sub-detail. It could be an entire planet, a space station, a city, or a ship with its insides and outsides. In a traditional game structure, these object containers themselves would be levels, or multiple game levels in their own right, which would require dedicated loading. In Star Citizen, as you move through the 3D game space, this hierarchy of object containers is loading in and out in the background in an efficient, multi-threaded manner to keep slowdowns to a minimum. Here in this debug view around Microtech, you can see how each of the demarcated red boxes show an object container. So the planet itself is an object container, the space station in orbit is another, and then the various points dotted around the surface of the planet are other object containers. Taken from a grander view even, when you load up the game initially after clicking the exe, a gigantic mega map of space is loaded in, and you changing game modes or loading up the active multiplayer component is you connecting to a server or your own listen server, and then the game streams in hot pockets of detail on demand as object containers. With object container streaming, the game allows you, the player, to travel at incredible speeds while also maintaining detail on the small scale and on incredibly large scales. How large of a scale can it go? Even larger than the planet Microtech in the game are some fields of interplanetary gas clouds. As a game doing many things for the first time ever really, Star Citizen has also made it a priority to render incredibly large volumetric clouds of gas or dust, something not done in games before actually. Here, artists and designers can create large, swirling, nebulous, or planetary ring-like 3D structures in external programs like Houdini, which are then exported out into the OpenVDB format. The engine then takes this format and represents it as a gigantic and overlapping voxel grid containing information in each voxel controlling things like gas density, emissiveness, color, and a whole host of other parameters. In the game, the gas medium itself is lit and shadowed in real time from the sun or any other light sources placed into it. It usually starts out as a near invisible smattering of color against the blackness of space, and then slowly transforms as light sources are added into it, representing pockets of especially active gas, chemical reactions, or other space phenomena. In doing so, a range of moods can be set by just changing the lighting, such as creating an angry large churning disk of matter around an active star, or the cool loneliness of a space station among the clouds with light flaring in pockets as gas meets. Since it is all done in real time, that means you can fly into it with your ship and watch as the larger structures from the distance become more diffuse as you fly in, until you are completely enveloped by this gas, covering all the space around you. For those areas where designers want even more detail, smaller formations of voxel gas and clouds can be placed into the overarching gas cloud to represent so-called hero details, like the smaller clouds found here around the jump gate. Or they can add in scattered objects into the clouds, like asteroid fields, where even the comparatively minuscule asteroids can cast real-time shadows on the extremely diffuse medium of gas surrounding them. You get these awesome volumetric shadows essentially. Like a lot of things in Star Citizen, the size of these gas clouds is hard to comprehend when you look at it on a computer screen. It is so large that it can look two-dimensional at normal ship speeds, but its huge 3D real-time nature reveals itself when the camera speed is pumped up to insane levels in the game editor, or when you see lights moving in and around and through it and casting shadows through it. More comprehensible in size but decidedly more complex in nature are the game's planets. And here is where we come back to Microtech. The technology making the current planets in the game like Microtech possible is on its 4th iteration and has greatly changed since the video I made on version 3.7 in November. Planetary development involves the work of graphics programming, physics programming, environmental artists, hard surface artists, VFX artists, and many more. They involve so many different skill sets as planets themselves are diverse in their own right. You have colder worlds, warmer worlds, barren worlds, and so on. An individual planet may be diverse as well, with various distinct biomes on it, with each having their own weather, effects, and different types of human settlements as well. So the challenge is creating the technology to represent such minute detail and diversity across an entire planetary surface, while not spending an eternity to achieve it. It is a challenge, all right, and with iteration 4 of their planetary tech, Cloud Imperium's developers that I talked to feel it has reached a great place. The basic idea behind planet generation in Star Citizen is about unifying much of the generation of the planet into interacting systems. And with the 4th iteration, a whole host of systems fall out of 2 primary ways to describe a planet: how warm of a place it is, and how wet of a place it is. So you have the humidity and heat. Based upon this sliding scale put on 2 axes, a planet is generated along with an elevation height map, and it is all informed by the sliding scale of humidity and heat that are represented by textures. So there will be textures defining the height of terrain, with mountains, plains, and valleys, and so forth, and corresponding textures describing the heat and wetness of the terrain at that elevation. These then overlay onto one another. With this, the developers have essentially mapped out an entire texture set describing how humidity, temperature, and elevation are scattered across an entire planetary surface. Here then, the developers decide upon ranges of variables in combination that describe a biome. So you can have a biome type where it is semi-humid and of a moderate temperature while at a very specific elevation range. You could also have another biome at that same elevation, but with different ranges of humidity and temperature. Imagine the difference between coastal cooler grasslands of Scotland and the stretching deserts of the Sahara as they meet the sea. They may be at similar elevations, but the temperature and humidity ranges found at each are very different. The 3D terrain underlying the biomes is made based on the texture height maps generated offline in terrain simulation tools, and then generated in real time on the CPU with tessellation in engine. To keep performance high and as few edges visible as possible, the GPU further tessellates the geometry as the camera gets closer to terrain. So here you can see the geometry making up terrain, subdividing into a greater density of triangles as the camera comes in, until the geometry size becomes a little larger than a centimeter. Alongside the planet geometry generating in real time in front of you, the collision mesh is generated in real time as well, which is pretty hard. This mesh is important as the planet needs to not only look nice, but you need to be able to interact with it as a physics object, so the players can walk on it, and so that it can have its own spherical gravity. With the terrain in place and generated, and humidity and temperature decided upon, artists will then cooperatively build assets like ground textures, rocks, bushes, boulders, and the like based upon different biome types. These assets are then placed on the planet as the artist sees fit. As the assets are placed, they are tied into that specific biome range. For example, a formation of rocks an artist placed in one location will also be found in any place of a similar biome type across the globe. So you could have something like medium elevation with a low temperature and a low humidity. Then the procedural generation aspect kicks in, and the game tools scatter similar configurations of assets like rocks at coordinates all across the globe that fall within those biome ranges for temperature, humidity, and elevation. In an exaggerated example here, you can see how an artist can target biome ranges that are highlighted with blue and scatters textures with exaggerated color with controllable parameters, like how dense of a fallout it has into other biomes. There you can see how the texture is not only painted locally, but all across the planet terrain where the conditions are similarly met. With assets like trees and specific rock formations, you can see how the procedural system scatters them in configurations across the areas of the planet based upon how the artist tweaks them at merely one location. To keep it all believable and coherent and not looking oddly stratified across the terrain or crudely placed, a number of other features need to come together, like the ability for objects and particles to partially inherit the color of the terrain that they are located in so they can fit together better, or for temporal dithering to occur between biome zones to smoothen their fall off as the view slowly goes away from the terrain into space, or for the ground color texturing to be modified based upon the objects placed on them. So you have something like trees, which from a planetary scale can still be seen in how they affect the planet's texture color, and manage to show the color of tree canopies even though the camera is so far away that the tree models themselves are actually not being rendered. As I was told in the interviews, a big push with the newer system for planet generation was to eliminate as much discontinuity as possible. And given the new texture-based approach, moving away up and down from the terrain on the surface makes it resolve detail in correspondence with your distance. This prevents terrain popping in that would be visible with earlier iterations of the technology, but that actually use multiple scales of textures in unison. Simply put, the valley feature you see on the ground is the exact same one that you will see in space, albeit a bit smaller from that view. In the end, with version 4 of planetary technology in Star Citizen Alpha 3.8, the developers have a planet with as many scattered biome types as the designers prefer based upon how they want to divide up those various ranges of height, humidity, and elevation. This may sound like it may only work on Earth-like planets, but just changing the paradigm of that system allows it to describe a whole host of other world types. Instead of describing humidity and temperature on a moon that is extremely cold and has no water, those same two texture types could describe levels of acidity or the presence of some other element, Thusly, can artists vary the terrain and asset scattering for more hostile environments with unique biomes. Tying all these biomes and 3D assets together are a number of other systems that leverage those exact same three textures of height, heat, and humidity. For example, you have weather and particle spawning, which is based upon all three texture types, where large storms, local fog, and particle effects are spawned in, and storms comprising massive particle swarms and fog of varying intensity ripple across the planet's surface. Or based upon the height map for terrain elevation, a ray marching step is performed through that height map so that terrain is given real-time soft shadows from the sun with proper penumbra and umbra that stretch as far into the distance as the eye can see, with no level of detail switching. This means that you can see massive shadows from the terrain on the planet from space. When all these effects combine, the game has the capability to represent diverse ecosystems on one planet with varying weather that dynamically responds to them. Due to the systemic nature of the planet generation, you can see some really unique effects. Like here, peering into the sky, you can see a faint glimmer of something out there lost in the blue. As time of day advances and the sun goes over the horizon, you can see that the faint glimmer in the sky is actually a space station in orbit, hundreds of kilometers above the planet's surface. It is actually being rendered the entire time while you're here on the ground. You can only see it now at this time of day, as it is still being lit by the sun over the horizon, while your vantage point on the planet has changed due to its rotation and you're now in the shadow cast by dusk. The space station out there in the void above the planet shares similar generation principles with the planet. Given how space stations outnumber planets in the game, they also need to be built in a varied manner and efficiently, and remain detailed. To achieve that, artists design rooms or tiny cubbies and other modular areas of detail and pieces within rooms with a variety of props and usable items. Using these bespoke modular bits that can have varied branding or varied architectural styles, a procedural tool takes them and systematically generates commonsensical layouts based upon a generation graph. In the end, an entire space station can be generated with lodging, a food court, and landing spaces and the like. The power of that same idea in the layout tool is harnessed to generate other areas of the game as well, such as the cave systems found on a number of planets where you can go spelunking for mining purposes or for loot. Or that system is used to populate the planets and moons with a number of lonely research outposts or mining stations that are scattered across tundras, wastes, and savannas. When viewing all these artist-authored yet procedurally scattered systems from the top down, it looks like CIG's plan to systematize and simplify their universe building has massively paid off. The visuals on Showcase are awesome, and more importantly, for the game itself, it has also increased the efficiency of development. For example, all of the game's pre-existing moons and planets built over nearly 2 years took just a few months to remake or convert to the new system. But it would not be a Chris Roberts game if it wasn't looking towards the future, looking to see how planetary tech can be iterated and changed to be improved over time. Visually, there are still a number of big wins that can be made to improve how these planets look and feel when you're on them. For example, at the moment, the pop-in that does occur no longer comes from the planet generation textures or geometry of the planet, but it can come from the level of detail ranges of cascaded shadow maps or the level of detail ranges for the scattered objects on the planet, like smaller rocks, trees, and boulders and such. To help this out at the moment, larger, more prominent structures like trees and tall buildings have especially far shadow map cascades or especially far level of detail ranges. But still, you can see the level of detail changing when you move at great speeds. The crutch, though, is that all the values for shadow range or level of detail range for scattered objects are tuned around the current performance of GPU and CPU in the game client. As I will discuss more in the next video on this, this is something that is going to change over time, so the distance of LODs and possible pop-in will change with it. Another example of work in progress features is found in the planetary atmosphere. The next updates after 3.8 will focus on adding in a much more realistic simulation of the atmosphere with systemic aspects regarding how it is colored and shaded, and with importantly adding in a more physically based planetary fog. Fog is currently handled by local Froxel fog volumes going out in front of the camera that is very close, and very distant atmospheric rendering that is rather uniform. The next iteration will utilize the planet's height map to draw fog into valleys far beyond the distance of that local Froxel grid. And like the terrain shadows, ray-marched volumetric shadows will pierce through this extremely distant fog. With this, you can see massive columns of fog being lit from the sun and shadowed by terrain all the way out into space. Lastly, there is how the planet terrain is currently indirectly lit outside of the sun. Currently, indirect lighting is done with screen space ambient occlusion, most similar to ground truth AO as found in Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and it is also lit with real-time probes that follow the player around, updating over a number of frames. This is done so that indirect lighting in the shadows corresponds to the environment surrounding the player character and the time of day. It works pretty well in the work in progress state that it's in, but developers are keen to advance how indirect lighting and global illumination are rendered in the future to increase fidelity even more. So at the highest end scale of gigantic gas clouds, down to immense Earth-sized planets, or even smaller human habitats, the developers working on Star Citizen have created tools that represent diversity and simulation features that are not too often seen, if ever seen, in games. But that is just one part of the story, the macro part of it. In the next episode of this series looking into the development of this game, I will be focusing on the micro details and those parts of the game's graphics and simulations that developers are working on right now and that are found in the current version. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Also, please consider supporting us on Patreon to get our videos in the highest quality possible and much more in the near future. If you want to talk to me about planetary generation, massive gas clouds, and the like, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.